I ignored my ex-wife at an event after 2 years, and walking away felt better than any revenge. People always tell you that time heals everything. I used to hate hearing that because after my divorce it felt like time wasn't healing anything at all. Every morning I woke up thinking about the same questions. How did someone I trusted for nearly 12 years become a complete stranger? What signs did I miss? Was I really that blind? For months those thoughts followed me everywhere. Then one day they didn't. I didn't notice exactly when it happened, but life slowly became quieter. The pain didn't disappear overnight. It just stopped being the first thing I thought about every morning. That's why seeing my ex-wife again after more than 2 years caught me completely off guard. I wasn't looking for closure anymore. I wasn't hoping she'd apologize. I wasn't interested in hearing excuses. Yet somehow one unexpected invitation brought everything full circle. 2 years earlier my life looked completely different. My ex-wife Lauren and I had what most people would describe as a normal marriage. We weren't rich, but we were comfortable. We bought a small house together, spent weekends fixing up the backyard, argued over what color to paint the kitchen, and joked about adopting another dog even though one already kept us busy enough. Looking back, those memories almost feel like they belonged to someone else. Friends constantly told us we were the stable couple. The funny thing about appearances is they're usually the last thing to tell the truth. The first sign something had changed wasn't dramatic. Lauren became distant. She started working late more often and insisted her department had taken on extra projects. I believed her because I had no reason not to. Marriage is built on trust, or at least I thought it was. Then came the small things. Her phone was always face down. She smiled at messages she'd never share. Weekend plans suddenly included work meetings that somehow couldn't be missed. Every time I asked if everything was okay, she'd kiss me on the forehead and tell me I was imagining things. Eventually I started believing maybe I was. One Friday evening I decided to surprise her by bringing dinner to her office. It wasn't because I suspected anything. I genuinely thought she'd appreciate the gesture after all the overtime she'd been putting in. When I arrived, the security guard looked confused and told me almost everyone had left hours earlier. I laughed awkwardly and explained that my wife said she was still working upstairs. He checked the office directory before looking back at me. Her floor's been empty since around 5. I remember standing there holding a bag of still warm food, convincing myself there had to be an explanation. Maybe she'd gone to another building. Maybe she'd stepped out for a meeting. Maybe. I called her, no answer. About 30 minutes later she finally texted saying she'd been too busy to look at her phone and was heading home. I didn't mention I'd been at her office. I simply waited. When she walked through the front door she looked tired but strangely nervous. I asked how work had been. Long, she sighed. That single word changed everything. I calmly told her I'd stopped by with dinner. The color disappeared from her face almost instantly. She tried explaining there had been a last-minute client meeting at another location, but the story kept changing every few minutes. I didn't yell, I simply listened. The more she talked, the less believable everything became. A week later I found the truth. I wasn't searching through her phone or trying to catch her. Fate simply got there before I did. While borrowing our shared tablet to pay a bill, a message notification appeared because her account was still connected. I wish I could say I looked away. I didn't. The message wasn't even subtle. It wasn't just emotional. It confirmed she'd been seeing someone else for months. My hand started shaking so badly I almost dropped the tablet. I remember sitting there in complete silence, hoping I'd misunderstood something. I hadn't. When she got home that evening I placed the tablet on the kitchen table without saying a word. She looked at the screen, then at me, and immediately started crying. She admitted everything within minutes. It wasn't a mistake. It wasn't one bad decision. It had been going on for months. The worst part wasn't even hearing about the affair. It was discovering how many lies had been built around it. Every late meeting, every girls' night, every fake business trip, they all suddenly made sense. I asked her one question. Why? She cried harder before saying something I'll never forget. I didn't think you'd ever find out. I'm sorry, I made the biggest mistake of my life. Her first concern was getting caught. In that moment I realized our marriage had already ended long before I discovered the truth. The weeks that followed were the darkest period of my life. Friends encouraged me to fight for the marriage while others told me to leave immediately. Lauren begged for another chance, insisting she'd end the affair and do anything to fix what she'd broken. For a while I actually considered it. 12 years isn't something you throw away easily. I wanted to believe people could change. But every time I looked at her I wondered if she was telling the truth or simply telling me what I wanted to hear. Eventually I filed for divorce. Signing those papers felt surreal. I wasn't just ending a marriage, I was saying goodbye to the future I'd spent years imagining. The house we'd planned to raise children in had to be sold. The vacations we'd talked about would never happen. Every dream we'd built together disappeared with a signature. The divorce itself wasn't messy. The healing afterward was. For nearly a year I avoided weddings, family gatherings, and even mutual friends because I didn't want to risk seeing her. I deleted social media, started going to the gym, buried myself in work, and slowly rebuilt my life one day at a time. Some mornings were easier than others. Some nights I questioned everything. But little by little I became someone I actually recognized again. By the second year, things were different. I'd received a promotion at work. I'd moved into a new apartment. I started laughing again. Most importantly, I stopped wondering what Lauren was doing. She no longer occupied space in my mind. Then one afternoon my cousin called to remind me about our grandmother's 80th birthday celebration. Nearly the entire extended family would be there, including relatives I hadn't seen since before the divorce. I happily accepted the invitation without thinking twice. It wasn't until the night before the event that my sister casually mentioned something she'd forgotten to tell me. "Oh, Lauren's probably going to be there too. Grandma said she was invited because everyone was close with her for so many years." For a moment I just stared at my phone. After more than 2 years, the woman who shattered my trust, the woman I hadn't spoken to since the divorce, was going to be standing in the same room as me. I had no idea what I was going to do, but one thing was certain. I wasn't going there looking for revenge. Seeing her again wasn't the victory she expected. The next morning I spent far more time getting ready than I wanted to admit. It wasn't because I wanted to impress Lauren. That part of my life was over. I think I just wanted to remind myself how much I'd changed over the last 2 years. I put on a navy suit I'd bought after my promotion, polished my shoes, and looked in the mirror for a moment before leaving. The man staring back at me wasn't the same broken husband who had signed divorce papers with shaking hands. Life hadn't been perfect since then, but it had been peaceful. For the first time in a long time, I genuinely liked the person I'd become. The celebration was held at a country club my grandmother had always loved. The parking lot was already full when I arrived, and I could hear laughter coming from inside before I even reached the entrance. The room was beautifully decorated with old family photographs, flowers, and a giant banner celebrating 80 incredible years. My cousins immediately pulled me into conversations, asking about work and joking about childhood memories. For the first 30 minutes I almost forgot Lauren was even there. Then I saw her. She was standing near the dessert table talking to one of my aunts. Our eyes met for less than 2 seconds. She smiled. I didn't. I simply nodded politely, turned around, and continued the conversation I was already having with my uncle. That was it. No dramatic confrontation, no angry speech, no sarcastic comment, just nothing. Oddly enough, that felt far more powerful than anything I'd imagined during those sleepless nights after the divorce. About 20 minutes later, I was helping my grandfather carry drinks to one of the tables when I noticed Lauren slowly walking in my direction. My heart beat a little faster, but I kept arranging the glasses as if I hadn't noticed. She stopped beside me and quietly said my name. "Hey," I looked up, gave a polite smile, and replied, "Hi." There was another awkward silence. "I've been meaning to talk to you for a long time," she said. "I hope you're doing well," I answered calmly before picking up the tray and walking toward another table. I didn't wait for her response. I wasn't trying to be rude. I simply wasn't interested in reopening a chapter I'd already closed. As I walked away, I could almost feel her watching me. Years earlier, I would have given anything for that conversation. Now I realized I didn't need it anymore. The rest of the afternoon continued surprisingly well. I laughed with cousins I hadn't seen in years, played cards with my younger nephews, and listened to my grandmother tell the same stories she'd been telling for decades. For once, I was completely present instead of trapped inside my own thoughts. Later, while standing outside with a few relatives, my cousin leaned over and quietly asked, "Did Lauren try talking to you?" I nodded, and I wished her well. That's it. He smiled and said something that stayed with me. Sometimes silence says more than an argument ever could. As the evening went on, I noticed Lauren glancing toward me several times, not in an angry way, more like someone trying to figure out why things weren't going the way they expected. Maybe she'd imagined we'd finally have the emotional conversation we'd never had after the divorce. Maybe she expected me to ask questions or show resentment. Instead, I was genuinely enjoying my evening without her. Toward the end of dinner, my grandmother asked if anyone wanted to share a memory before dessert. One by one, family members stood up and told funny stories from years gone by. Eventually, it was my turn. I stood up, smiled at my grandmother, and thanked her for always teaching us that family wasn't measured by perfection, but by how people treated one another during difficult times. I talked about resilience, kindness, and appreciating the people who stand beside you when life falls apart. I never mentioned Lauren, not once, yet as I spoke I noticed her quietly staring at the floor. When everyone applauded, my grandmother hugged me and whispered, "I'm proud of the man you've become." Those words meant more to me than she could ever know. After dessert, I stepped outside onto the patio for some fresh air. The sun had almost disappeared, leaving the sky painted orange and purple. I stood there enjoying the quiet until I heard footsteps behind me. It was Lauren again. "I just wanted 5 minutes," she said softly. I took a deep breath before answering. "You've had 2 years." She looked down. "I know. I've apologized 100 times in my head." I nodded politely but stayed silent. She continued, "I know I don't deserve forgiveness. I just wanted you to know, leaving you is the biggest regret of my life." For a brief second I saw the woman I used to know, not the one who lied, not the one who betrayed my trust, just someone carrying the weight of her own decisions. Years ago hearing those words would have meant everything to me. Now, they meant almost nothing. I looked at her calmly and said, "I don't hate you anymore." She looked relieved, then I continued, "But I also don't miss you." The relief disappeared from her face. I wasn't trying to hurt her, I was simply telling the truth. "I hope your life turns out well," I said. "I really do, but my life finally started moving forward when I stopped looking backward." Without waiting for a response, I smiled politely, wished her a good evening and walked back inside to join my family. As I reached the doorway I glanced back one last time. She was still standing there, not crying, not angry, just quietly accepting that some doors once closed aren't meant to be opened again. And although I didn't realize it then, the very next morning I would receive a phone call that would make me see our entire marriage and our divorce in a completely different light. The best revenge was never revenge at all. The next morning I was making coffee when my phone rang. The caller ID showed my former father-in-law's name. We hadn't spoken since the divorce, so I almost let it go to voicemail. Curiosity got the better of me and I answered. He greeted me warmly before apologizing for calling out of the blue. Then he said something I wasn't expecting. "I heard you saw Lauren yesterday." I paused for a moment before replying, "Yeah." "We crossed paths at Grandma's birthday." He let out a quiet sigh. "I just wanted to tell you, thank you." I frowned. "For what?" He was silent for a few seconds before saying, "For being the bigger person." He explained that after I left the party, Lauren had gone home unusually quiet. Later that evening she'd admitted to her parents that seeing me again made her realize how much of her own life she'd thrown away. She'd expected anger. She'd expected bitterness. Instead, she'd seen someone who had moved on without needing to prove anything. According to him, that affected her far more than any argument ever could have. I didn't really know how to respond. For years I'd imagined what I'd say if I ever saw her again. In reality, I barely said anything at all. Before ending the call, my former father-in-law said something that stayed with me. "When the divorce happened, I was angry at both of you because I didn't know the full story. Once I learned the truth, I realized you handled everything with more dignity than most people would have. I know this doesn't change the past, but I'm sorry." Hearing those words gave me a strange sense of closure. Not because I needed his approval, but because it reminded me that the truth has a way of revealing itself over time. A few weeks passed and life returned to normal. I threw myself into work, spent more time with friends, and continued building the life I'd worked so hard to create. One Friday afternoon, while grabbing lunch with a coworker, I ran into an old mutual friend who'd known both Lauren and me since college. After catching up for a few minutes, he hesitated before asking if I'd heard anything about Lauren. I told him I hadn't, and honestly I preferred it that way. He nodded and said, "She's been through a rough couple of years." Apparently the relationship she'd left our marriage for hadn't lasted very long. It ended less than a year after our divorce. Since then she'd changed jobs, moved apartments twice, and had been trying to rebuild her own life. As he spoke, I noticed something surprising. I didn't feel happy, I didn't feel vindicated, I didn't even feel angry. I simply hoped she eventually found peace. That realization caught me off guard. For so long I'd believed healing meant reaching a point where I could celebrate her failures. Instead, healing turned out to be something completely different. It meant her life no longer controlled my emotions. Several months later, my grandmother invited everyone over for a small family barbecue. Lauren wasn't there this time, and nobody even mentioned her. We laughed, ate too much food, and spent hours telling stories from when we were kids. At one point, my grandfather pulled me aside and handed me an old photograph he'd found while cleaning the attic. It showed me as a teenager helping him build a wooden fence in his backyard. He smiled and said, "You know why I kept this picture?" I shook my head. "Because every time one of those fence boards broke, you'd get frustrated and want to replace the whole thing. I'd always tell you the same thing." I laughed because I already knew what he was about to say. "Not everything that's broken needs to stay broken," he said. Then he looked me in the eyes and added, "But some things aren't meant to be rebuilt. They're meant to teach you how to build something better." Those words hit me harder than he probably realized. For years I'd looked at my divorce as the worst thing that had ever happened to me. Standing there beside my grandfather, I finally saw it differently. The divorce wasn't the end of my story. It was the beginning of a version of myself that I'd never have become otherwise. A year later I met someone new. It happened naturally. There were no games, no pretending, no constant fear of being lied to. The relationship grew slowly because we'd both learned the value of honesty the hard way. I didn't compare her to Lauren because they were completely different people. More importantly, I wasn't trying to replace my past anymore. I was simply enjoying my present. One evening we were sitting on the balcony watching the sunset when she asked if I'd ever been married. I smiled. "I was. Do you ever think about her?" I looked out at the horizon for a moment before answering honestly. "Not in the way I used to." "What changed?" I thought about it for a second before saying, "I stopped asking why things happened and started asking what they taught me." She reached over and held my hand. That simple gesture reminded me of something I'd almost forgot after my divorce. Love isn't supposed to feel like constant uncertainty, it should feel like peace. Looking back now, people sometimes ask whether ignoring my ex-wife at that family event was my way of getting revenge. The truth is, it wasn't revenge at all. Revenge would have been trying to embarrass her, trying to make her cry, trying to make everyone take my side. Instead, I simply treated her like someone from a chapter of my life that had already ended. No hatred, no insults, no dramatic speech. Just acceptance. Ironically, that silence became the loudest thing I could have said. If there's one lesson I've learned, it's this: when someone betrays your trust, don't waste years trying to make them understand your pain. Spend that energy rebuilding yourself instead. One day you'll wake up and realize the person who hurt you no longer has the power to ruin your happiness. That's real freedom. Advice healing doesn't happen when the other person apologizes. It happens when you stop needing the apology to move forward. Protect your peace, respect yourself, and never let someone else's mistakes define the rest of your life. Don't forget to subscribe for more emotional, original Reddit-inspired stories and life lessons.